Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I am your host, Maryann Petri. There's a non-denominational retreat weekend at the Resolution Center of Jacksonville, Florida. This will be a time of support and renewal for parents and grandparents on the journey of parental alienation, standing strong in resilience, paving the way for good health and a great future. This will take place April 22nd through the 24th at the Resolution Center of Jacksonville, Florida. I will have all the details in the podcast notes. You can also reach markdavidroseman.com workshops, and I will have that link in the podcast notes. I have a return guest. I have Dr. Sam Sugar back on the podcast with me. He was last on season 3, episode 33, where we talked about the beginning, the middle, and the end of abusive guardianships. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it on preventing guardianships and what to do if you can't. I welcome you, Dr. Sam Sugar, to the show. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you for having me again.
Definitely. You know, I was just looking at an article where even if you have a will and you think you're going to, I don't know, think this will is going to be honored, somehow they can override that.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. So maybe we can start with something positive. And that is if you go to the trouble of making advance directives, and to be clear, advance directives refer to a durable power of attorney to give instructions for how your money and estate is to be handled, plus another document called Health Care Power of Attorney, which addresses how you want your health care matters to be handled when you can no longer do it yourself, and usually a third document called a will. If you go to the trouble and expense of making all of those, and recommend that everybody does, although a little bit better than the typical one that's being created in the country now. If you do that, the chances are very good that those wishes will be followed, and what will happen is exactly what you intended to happen. Unless
Mm-hmm.
those documents are challenged in an equity administrative probate court, in which case the court unilaterally and with little or no evidence can decide that no, that isn't a good idea. The judge knows better. And if those advanced directives are properly, not properly, but challenged significantly by a probate litigator, they can easily be rejected, thrown out, abrogated, curtailed, disappeared. And then you become a person with no advance directives, which leaves you open to the court's unilateral opinion of what's best for you as a ward of the state. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the phrase that's used all the time to justify what happens in probate court. It's actually a misdirection. It's called the best interests of the ward. And of course, that's obviously something very subjective, because
Mm-hmm.
what's best in my mind might not be best in your mind. But the only opinion that matters is the judge. So, yes, you're absolutely correct. Although it's a very good idea to have advance directives, and that idea gained a lot of purchase in Florida with a particular guardianship of a young woman who was comatose and ultimately died of starvation during the second George Bush administration when
Mm-hmm.
Jeb Bush was governor of Florida. That case started the big push for advance directives to avoid guardianships. And ironically, those very advanced directives have turned out not to be very probative in guardianship cases. They can easily be thrown out.
Mm-hmm. Then, as you're making out your will, you're just throwing away money. It just, you don't know
No,
how.
no. So let's put it in perspective. There isn't a guardian boogeyman around every corner. There just isn't.
Okay.
Guardianships affect a small percentage of the population. And the real question is, how many people are in guardianships? How big
Mhm,
an issue is this? And that in itself is wrapped in a riddle. Nobody knows. We all have guesses.
mhm,
But because states don't allow the collection of statistics yet, and because there are no real ideas from the 50 states of how many guardianships exist in any county, any state, any district, or in the country, the best guesses, I think, are very much off. The federal government has stated on numerous occasions they think there's 1.3 million guardianships. I don't believe that for a second. Based on my own experience, there are between 3 and 3.5 million guardianships in the United States, but that's just a guess. And anybody who tells you they know how many guardianships there are anywhere is either lying or guessing.
mhm,
So it isn't an overwhelming problem where less than 1% of the country at most is affected by it. But there's a trick in that calculation. For every one ward in a guardianship, there could be as many as dozens of individuals negatively impacted by that guardianships. What do I mean? Well, if an individual is placed into a guardianship, that individual usually has a family, especially when we're talking about professional guardianships. And every member of that family is affected either emotionally, psychologically, and certainly financially because of the incredible way that guardianships make money disappear into the pockets of the professional guardians and their downstream enablers.
mhm,
So the grandmother who saved and worked hard and did all the right things all of her life, who intended to pass down the family farm or the family apartment building or the family business, doesn't get to do that. Their money is dissipated in litigation and other issues. The next generation and the next generation after that doesn't have the benefit
mhm,
of that inheritance, which means they may not go to college, they may not live as well as they might otherwise have. And all of the probate court, all of the administrative equity courts, including probate, family, and divorce, do the same thing. The damage is not limited to one or even two generations, it's intergenerational. And that's really the shame of this all, um, particularly in professional guardianships. The money and the security that people work for their entire lives is frittered away in these ridiculous guardianship litigation cases that go on for decades.
in this litigation, I remember going to Superior Court, and I heard these lawyers arguing, and they were saying this case has gone on for 15 years. I was listening to them talk to the judge about this a case going on 15 years.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
like,
it's not unusual. Uh, I'm aware of cases that have gone on for 20 years. And I will tell you, based on our organization, Americans Against Abuse of Probate Guardianship, we've had national surveys and questionnaires that indicate not only do these cases go on for a long time, but the average mean actually number of lawyers that people against guardianship have had to hire to litigate against a guardianship, the number is six. Going through six lawyers over a period of a decade or more, you can just imagine the angst and sturm, the psychological trauma, not to mention the enormous waste of money for hiring these lawyers
mhm,
who are all part of the same fraternity of probate litigators. Um, it's a terrible situation, and it's one that we've been fighting against for a long time because these things are just emotionally incomprehensible and
mhm,
legally very, very questionable. It's hard to understand why these things happen until you understand that, particularly in professional guardianships, it's about power and money.
Mhm. And what people don't realize, and when you said, that you go through 6 lawyers, a lot of people don't understand you just don't hire a lawyer, you have to pay their retainer fee. Then once they chew through that, then you're paying them by the hour, and then once that lawyer doesn't work out, then you have to move on to another lawyer where you're paying another retainer fee, and once they chew through that, it's the same cycle, and I think a lot of people don't realize that happens to people.
What's even worse than that is that, and I experienced this myself, when you do become entangled in this mess, what you want to do is hire the best lawyer you can find.
Mhm,
But this fraternity of probate litigators, and it's a very small number, comparatively speaking, my guess is that in Florida, that has over 120,000 lawyers registered to practice, less than 200 of them actually are involved in probate litigation. And I think it's probably even much smaller than that. When you go to hire one of them, whom you think might be the best, you will find that they find excuses to not represent you, meaning they create a or have an actual conflict of interest,
mhm,
which is why all of these lawyers hire all of their other lawyers to do small things for them. So, handle a parking ticket or whatever, which means they have a conflict of interest and you can't hire them. So that when you do need to hire a lawyer, you are never going to be able to find the best there is. And if you even can, the chances are you can't afford them because hourly rates in Florida and places like New York and California are close to 4 digits an hour. Some
mm,
of them are as low as 450 or 500, but most of them are between 500 and 1,000. And when you realize, for example, in discovery, which is a
mhm,
joke in and of itself, where these lawyers all come together in a meeting room and there's 2 lawyers on your side and 3 lawyers on their side, these discovery meetings can cost $20,000 a day.
mm,
And they go on for days and days, not to mention all of the other people who are billing, like the paralegals and the junior associates. I once counted that in a case that I'm intimately familiar with, there were 42 lawyers doing billing at one time or another. And
mm.
that's not unusual. Or maybe, I shouldn't say that. That isn't typical, but it's not unheard of. So
That's
the lawyers know how to play this game really well, and they are in it not because they care about your mom or dad, because they don't. They're in it to make money. And the way you make money when you're a lawyer is to litigate and litigate and litigate. And the way you create litigation is to create conflict.
mhm,
So rather than solving a problem for which the guardianship was created, instead of solving a problem,
mhm.
the litigation creates layers and layers and layers of more problems. And the only people who profit from it are the lawyers.
That's interesting you should say that. I mean, even when it comes to, you said family court is also a probate court, but they create layers and layers. So you have to litigate more and you've got to litigate harder to fight for what you are trying to accomplish, and it just is
Right. Well,
impossible.
it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you, and by the way, we're talking about equity courts, the 3 equity courts of probate, family, and divorce. In an equity court, every time one lawyer does or says something, the other lawyer is forced to respond. That's the way contested guardianships work, or
Mhm,
any litigated situation. So all the attorneys have to do is find one conflict after another, and the people against the guardianship, or I call them OTGs, opposed to guardianship, are forced to have their lawyer join in the battle again and again and
Mhm.
again. And that's why the lawyers all make money coming or going, winning or losing. The only people who lose in all of this stuff is everybody else, including society. And that's a much larger question, and one that I ponder all the time. What on earth are we doing to ourselves with these absurd litigations and rules and courts? It just seems like, because I believe guardianship is a microcosm of our greater society, I just fear we've lost our way.
Mhm. How do you think this all got out of control? I know we were talking earlier about the Osage tribe, and we were talking about the orphan train as well, but, we were talking about the book Killers of the Flower Moon, written by David Grann, and, do you think all of this just kind of blossomed from the orphan train and this Osage tribe
Well,
from ago?
i- if you go into, and what you're referring to is the predicates to today's modern probate system, you really need to understand the history of the probate system, which came over from England. And
Mm,
in England, the probate system was actually called the chancery system, run by the court, run by the church usually, and it all derived from something called parens patriae. That's
mhm,
really the source for all of these issues in all three of these courts. And parens patriae means the government, in those days the king, takes full responsibility for everything that happens to his subjects.
mhm,
He's the father of the country. And when the black letter law in England wasn't sufficient to resolve conflicts that involved money or feelings, this secondary court was run by the church, so that, for example, a farmer whose cow was killed by another person might get a judgment in the black letter law that says, you have to give me the value of the cow, and that's the way it ends. But the farmer says, that was my favorite cow in the world.
mm,
I love that cow, and it's worth much more than the money you're going to give me. And the equity court was supposed to figure all that out and do something that's called equitable with their equitable powers. Well, that system became very prone to influence and corruption, and something called the star chambers. A star chamber was a courtroom that had stars painted on the top, but it
mm,
became famous because it was so corrupt and so easily corrupted. That system, with all its flaws, came over from England and existed independent of the courts of law until 1929. In 1929, the equity courts, which are established in our Constitution, by the way, were joined at the hip with the civil and criminal courts. But in between, and even since then, those equity courts, and particularly probate courts, have a very dark history. And just to mention a couple of them, the Osage Indian issue in that wonderful book, Killers of the Flower Moon, was when the Osage Indians found land on their oil in the West, and they were considered too stupid and savage to manage their own money. So judges in New York sent guardians from New York to help them in their best interests.
mm,
And they wound up not only stealing almost all of the money, but killing most of the Osage Indians. That led, actually, those investigations to the murders led to the creation of the FBI by a young man named J. Edgar Hoover. That's one example. But another example of how probate court has been misused is the eugenics movement. Now, when I say the eugenics movement, most people think of Nazi Germany, where the Aryan race needed to be cleansed of all the non-Aryan blood, especially Jewish blood.
mhm,
Um, but that program had its roots in America, actually in Midwest America, where there was a similar eugenics movement that wanted to keep the blood of our nation clean. And um, not contaminated by people who were less than perfect.
Mhm.
So what they did is they took these people who might have a birth defect or who were mentally challenged, what we might call today, we might give them a different name than mentally challenged. You're going to have to stop here. I'm going to have to answer that.
Oh,
Hello, one of our neighbors.
okay.
So the eugenics movement in the United States began to round up people who were, in some people's minds, less than good enough and sterilize them. And we wound up with literally thousands of young women in particular who were sterilized and unable to reproduce based on someone's decision that they were imperfect and needed a guardianship to allow the court to sterilize them. So the
Mm,
guardianship business has a dark history. And this is not to say that all guardianships are horrible. They're not. I'm sure a number of them work the way they're supposed to. But my focus has been on the modern version of the professional probate guardianship system.
mhm,
And it's my bias based on interacting with thousands of victims and reviewing thousands of cases over the last decade that the system is fatally broken and it cannot be fixed, and that we need to reimagine this entire concept of how we allow the government to intercede in the private lives of individuals who have committed no crime,
mhm,
allegedly to help them when they're vulnerable. The same logic can be applied for divorce court and for family court.
mhm. Now, also earlier, we were talking about this orphan train. We had talked about this, I mean, after we ended our last podcast. And then one of my friends started talking about this orphan train and explained it to me. Can you tell me more about that? Because that also contributed to this problem as well.
Sure. Well, um, in New York in particular, they had a problem. The governmental officials had a problem with street urchins. What's a street urchin? We don't use that word these days. These children were either the products of very poor or even dead parents who roamed the streets, creating a little havoc, stealing to stay alive, and they were considered a very bad nuisance. They were unsupervised, they couldn't be controlled. You couldn't really put them in jail because they were too young. So, what do you do with a street urchin? Well, at the time, in between the wars, the Great World Wars, there were farmers in the Midwest who were in need of farm workers who they wouldn't have to pay. And the solution became, well, let's take all these street urchins, put them on a train, and this was done by charities in New York who thought they were doing a wonderful thing,
Mm,
and ship them out all over the Midwest of the United States to farm families that needed help. Now, in those days, there were only family farms, not like today when 95% of farms are owned by agribusiness. And the people who did the farming were the children of the farmers. And if you didn't have enough children, you couldn't do farming, and those farms would not produce.
mm,
So, as a public service, they took those urchins and gave them, by way of the courts, to these farmers, which I suppose was a good thing for the farmers. I don't know if it was a good thing for the urchins or not, but they weren't urchins anymore. At least they had some type of parental unit in charge of them.
mm,
So the courts do this stuff all the time. They reach into families, or they reach out to families and intervene in the private affairs of innocent citizens, as these kids were.
mm. I think that created just a big mess. and led us down this path, uh, with these guardianships of no return.
Well, you can be sure that guardianships are guardianships of no return. And again, I focus on professional guardianships, and maybe it pays to repeat. The most common, frequent type of guardianship is a family guardianship. And while there are absolutely problems with family guardianships, and there are, because family guardians aren't well trained, they don't know the paperwork they're supposed to do. And let's face it, families are dysfunctional in the United States. There's a recent survey that says, in a survey, 90% of Americans believe their family is dysfunctional.
Mhm.
That's a whole different discussion, which is a very important one. But families who are dysfunctional create dysfunctional children who become dysfunctional family members in their own families.
Mhm.
So family guardianships have their own set of issues, and there are public guardianships, which generally are reserved for people with no assets and are on the public dole. And they have their problems too. But the most egregious abuses, in my opinion, that occur in these probate equity courts are professional guardianships, which are all about money, and not the least bit, in my opinion, about the best interests of the ward. And
Mhm.
just to emphasize that point and how that system has grown, in the early part of the 2000s, I want to say like 2009, there were a total of uh, 13 or 14 professional guardians in the state of Florida. Today, there's close to 700. Now, what would stimulate that kind of incredible exponential growth? The answer is it's extremely lucrative to be a
Mhm.
professional guardian. And it's very easy to be a professional guardian. In the state of Florida, do you know what requirements there are if you want to be a professional guardian in Florida?
I don't nothing, really.
Oh, well, no, it's more than nothing, but it's close to nothing. You have to be 18. You have to have finished high school or its equivalent. You have to have uh, pass the little rinky-dink test and pay a few dollars, and you can't have committed a felony. So
Mhm.
that means about 99% of the population of Florida, if they wanted to, could be a professional guardian. How do you become recognized as a professional guardian? Professional. Well, that must mean they've had specialized training and have a degree and advanced education and marvelous experience and mentorship and internship. Nope, none of the above. The only thing that makes you a professional a guardian, is to have or have had 3 other guardianships.
Hmm.
Think how silly that is. But that's exactly what the rules are. And those rules are changing a little bit, but it's that kind of thinking that, oh, well, he went to high school and he hasn't been in jail. He must be adequate to be a guardian. It's ridiculous. And when you're in the midst of one of these guardianships, you begin to realize how crazy the system is. It's crazy to think that an individual who's never committed a crime can lose their rights more quickly and more severely than a serial murderer. Because once you're put in a guardianship, you have no rights whatsoever. You can't decide where to live. You can't hire a lawyer. You can't decide who your friends are. You can't
Mhm.
travel. You can't make a contract. You're basically dead in the law and in the hands, in this case, of a total stranger who doesn't know you, who doesn't know your religious preferences or
Mhm.
care about them, doesn't know how you want to be buried, or who you want to talk to or visit with, where you want to live. None of that matters at all the minute that judge signs what's called letters of guardianship. You are a ward of the state, who you don't even really have a name anymore. That's a
Mhm.
technicality, but you are owned like a cow I mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
You are owned by a stranger by permission of the court, and that stranger controls every tiny aspect of your life. Everything. What you eat, what medicines you
Mhm.
take, what doctors you see, what kind of medical care you receive, whether you go into hospice or not.
Mhm.
Um, just every imaginable detail is controlled by an individual who does not know you and does not respect your family's wishes. I mean, who is better to take care of a parent than a child who wants to,
Mhm.
who owes that parent? That is all destroyed by the stroke of a judge's pen. And that's why people opposed to guardianship, usually it's a loving daughter, typically a daughter, sometimes a son, are so devastated by this because the entire foundation of their emotional life is completely shattered.
Mhm.
Blessed is the older person who has a child or children, who cares enough about them to sacrifice their own welfare for their own well being. I think I'm fortunate, I hope, when that day comes, that that will be me.
Mhm.
But I would be horrified to think that some judge, and we can talk about judges too, they are far from perfect,
Mhm.
would be willing to turn my life over to a total stranger who has 300 or 400 other people like me under their control, which is unthinkable. But in Florida, the apex predator guardian, who is still under indictment, whose trial has been postponed for years for one single count of elder abuse, um, is running free. I should mention that just this past week, one of the apex predators in guardianship, a fellow by the name of Linrod Douglas, who stole about $500,000 or so from a whole bunch of wards, was sentenced to 10 years. Finally, after
Mhm.
years, he'd been in prison or in jail already for almost a year or two. He's the rare exception. Most of these professional guardians have the blessings of the judges who appoint them and are accountable to almost no one.
Mhm.
And that's a good segue to talk about how are guardians held accountable?
Mhm.
Are they? Well, if you look at legislation in the Florida Senate, and I'm focusing on Florida, but this is a national issue, there have been um, little chipping away at the Florida statute, which is 744, for decades. Every year, somebody chips away a little bit this, they nibble at the edges of it. This year, there's legislation that creates a database, which is a wonderful thing, so that people supposedly could learn more about guardianship and study it. But the bar at the last second, and I think I mentioned this last time, at the last second put in an amendment to the legislation that says, yeah, yeah, you can have this database, but the only people who can ever look at it are the judges and clerks of court, which defeats the entire purpose of the database. So
Mhm.
legislation, in my humble opinion, will never be adequate to solve the problems that are created in professional or even family guardianships. There's just too much money in it, too much power in it, and too little supervision. Because you can't supervise something you can't even count.
Mhm.
So in most states, there are organizations or agencies, but unfortunately, agencies exist primarily for their own propagation. And let's just say, in a global way, that the supervision of guardians is lacking,
Mhm.
the supervision of judges is absent, and
Mhm.
the supervision of the system is horrible. And the result is abuse.
Mhm. This would probably also fall under with these doctors and medical professionals who are also contributing and conspiring in the system.
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm a board certified specialist in internal medicine. I'm a retired certified court examiner for a
Mhm,
probate court. So I'm familiar on a very visceral level with how this works and doesn't work. And unfortunately, some of my brethren in the medical profession have exhibited a callous disregard for the welfare of their patients by initiating or being complicit with the creation and maintenance of guardianships, as well as with the very unfortunate and sad intentional over medication of wards with extremely powerful and completely inappropriate atypical antipsychotic medications, which make zombies out of these wards who
mhm.
have no choice but to take them. It is a terribly sad commentary on my colleagues in this field, and it's inexcusable.
So when these families come in to see their loved one in this guardianship and they have a parent now that was responding and talkative, say 3 weeks ago, and now they're in a zombie state due to these antipsychotics, they can't talk to their parent, they can't communicate. Sometimes I've heard, like, dentures have been taken away, things like that. Y
Unfortunately, a system that depends on the good intentions of people who make money from that system is bound to fail because money will supersede. When a family member finds a patient, a loved one, in a senior housing warehouse, because that's
Mhm,
what these are, because they've sold their house for money to pay their own fees, that is, the guardians and lawyers' fees. It's not just atypical antipsychotics that they're getting. They're getting tranquilizers,
mhm,
antidepressants, atypical antipsychotics, pain medicines, and sleeping medicines.
mhm,
The lethal cocktail. And the fact
mhm,
that these elderly people survive that is quite amazing too. But these drugs are designed, they're called controller drugs to keep
mhm,
the ward quiet. And when a family comes in, if they're allowed in, to see their family member and complains about it and raises a ruckus, the antidote to that for the system, that is, for the guardian and the facility owners who are complicit in all of this, is to ban the entry of the family member forever. And the facility owner can do that because it's private property and they can get a
mhm,
restraining order. The court can do it as they did it against me.
mhm,
um, I'll never forget that one, where they ban you from being anywhere near the ward because you upset them or you're a danger to them or you're trying to kill them. I was accused twice of trying to poison my mother-in-law.
mhm,
And that's ridiculous. First of all, I liked her a lot.
mhm,
But the court decided to take blood tests for my mother in law simply on the allegation of a lawyer that I was trying to kill her because I was such an evildoer. I was such a criminal. I was a thief. I was called every name in the book, every name in the book, just like every other victim of abusive guardianship, because that's the playbook. There has to be a good guy, there has to be a bad guy. It's the same thing in divorce, it's the same thing in family court. You can't have conflict without a good guy and a bad guy. Once you're the bad guy, even if you're the best guy in the world, you will never win. You will never be vindicated. And worst of all, you will never have a chance to speak a word in these courts because these courts don't allow you to speak English. You have to speak legalese. And the only people who are good enough to speak legalese are bar members because they're so smart and so pristine and they know everything they need to know. It's all a racket.
Mhm.
No family member until a sentencing trial
Mhm.
has ever, to my knowledge, unless they're pro se, which is suicidal,
Mhm.
um, gets the opportunity to defend themselves.
Mhm.
And because there's so many conflicts swirling around all the time, you're just dealing with the conflict of the moment. And you never get to address the ultimate underlying conflict that all of this is wrong.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's incredibly frustrating. It leads to PTSD, and I'm in serious PTSD. It
Mhm.
was written about in a book called The Legal Abuse Syndrome.
Mhm.
Um, and it's true. I refer to it as legal warfare or lawfare that takes a toll no less than you would suffer on the battlefield watching a war, because it is a war. And when you step back from that war to realize this was about helping someone, this was about protecting someone, this was about to return the humanity that might have been lost when somebody loses some of their faculties. It's to protect them from predators. It's to protect them from embezzlement and stealing. And when they're vulnerable, to give them assistance so that they can live out their days in some degree of dignity. And it's anything but that.
And that's very sad. This is, people are comparing this to a RICO racketeering type of, industry. And
Mhm.
as you said, the people watching the the ward go through this are suffering PTSD and incurring other illnesses due to the stress.
Well, it's not only that, which is bad enough, but it's time. Because every hour that you spent poring over legal papers or talking to lawyers or going to the police or whatever is an hour you take away from your rest of your family,
Mhm,
your profession, your the way you make money, and more importantly, your leisure.
mhm,
People who are involved in all of this do not have any leisure time. They're up all night looking
mhm,
over papers and talking to other people. Their lives are shattered and they
mhm,
never recover.
mhm,
Never. Because once you've been through this, you realize the cruelty of man to man. You realize how our system, as well intended as it might be, is inhabited by predators.
mhm,
It's such a difficult thing to understand. This is supposed to be America where we have all have rights guaranteed not just by the Constitution, but by our Creator. And there's a system in place here to strip you of those rights worse than if you had committed serial murder. It's intrinsically just so bizarre that the system we rely on to help people when they're vulnerable attacks them in the most vile way. And there's nothing you can do about it. I mean,
mhm,
that's the sad conclusion. There isn't a thing you can do about it, because once somebody goes to a probate judge and says the magic words, and I'll tell you what those magic words are right now. They are, quote, "Your Honor, there is an individual in this jurisdiction who is at risk of being exploited, abused, or neglected," end quote.
mm,
That's all they have to say. Immediately, the judge begins a process called an incapacity evaluation. And immediately, that person starts falling into the abyss. That individual who's been accused of being abused, neglected, and exploited, falling into an abyss that ends in their death prematurely,
mm,
and in the torture of not only the ward, but anyone who cares about them in these abusive guardianships. And
mhm,
that's not to say that all professional guardianships are terrible. They're not. But over and over again in researching this, we see the same names of the guardians, the same lawyers, and the same judges, which is why we call them guardianship hotspot courts. And
Mm.
I can rattle off the name of 10 judges, the name of at least 20 lawyers, and at least 15 or 20 guardians whose names I've seen over and over and over again. And they just go on about their business because the supervisory mechanisms for the judges in particular, and let's face it, none of this would happen without the judges, none of it.
Mhm.
And there are some wonderful judges in Florida. I happen to know a couple of them. They're marvelous people, and they would never do anything like this. They wouldn't. But there are other judges who are not, and they are never supervised or monitored. The only way you can complain about a judge is to the Judicial Qualifications Commission, and I reviewed their statistics not long ago. And unless a judge has been caught having sex on the bench or drinking on the bench, or God forbid, misusing campaign funds, oh
Mhm.
my God, campaign funds,
Mhm.
they don't ever even get a slap on the wrist. And they're in there for life, and we're stuck with them.
Yeah, I've always said these judges should be, going through random drug testing and psychological evals once a year.
Yeah, good luck with that.
In the perfect world, you know?
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be a perfect world for them because
Uh,
they're human beings too. They have all the weaknesses and foibles we do, but we place them in this position of ultimate authority, which is something societies have to do. I mean, we need to have judges,
mhm,
but we need to have meticulously honest and unbiased judges. And
mhm,
unfortunately, once you are a judge in some of these particular hotspots, you fall into biases, you fall into patterns, you fall into trust with certain individuals.
mhm,
I mean, if you've given 10 guardianships to this professional guardian and another judge gave the same guardian 10, well, you begin to have a bias. So, well, this guardian's okay. I haven't had too many complaints about them. So let's give them the next 50. But when you realize that one particular guardian had as many as 400 ongoing cases at any one time, how on earth can a judge say, well, why don't they say, well, how are you taking care of all of these people? I don't see how that's even possible. But that question never gets asked because the
mhm,
primary aspect of a judge's life is clearing his docket. And if he can clear his docket more quickly, there's more time for him to do his personal life.
mhm,
So while I don't malign all judges, that's ridiculous. Many judges are the salt of the earth. There are some that create this problem, whether it's intentionally or for profit or for whatever reason. I'm not accusing. They create more problems than they solve.
mhm, mhm. And going back to when you said, some of these family members get banned from going to see their family member in these elderly warehouses, they're perpetuating the alienation of the child wanting to see the parent.
Yeah, well, parental alienation, as you're very familiar with, not only involves a parent not being able to see their minor child, but alienation is perhaps the strongest punishment, the
Mhm,
most egregious punishment for standing up to a guardianship or a visitation schedule that's been violated. When you tell somebody who loves someone else that they can't see them ever again, either because it's a court order or because they've been disappeared. That's the other
mhm,
thing we haven't talked about is 18-year-olds who get disappeared on their birthday so that somebody can raid their settlement, a birth defect settlement.
mhm,
That's very common. It's just awful. But it's the same thing. Kidnapping or alienating family members who love each other and care for each other is the worst punishment you can give to someone who cares about another person.
Mhm.
I once had a discussion years ago with a legislator in Tallahassee, Florida, and I was trying to convince them about legislation that I was promoting that ultimately created the OPPG, the Office of Public and Professional Guardian in Florida. And he was against it because he said, "What you're proposing, sir, is that my fellow bar members might make less money." And I said, and I was shocked, but he was being
Mhm.
honest. And I said, "You know what, Senator? I'll make a deal with you. You keep all the damn money. Give me back my loved one."
Mhm.
And he changed his mind and voted in favor, unanimously, actually, the whole Senate did, of the legislation. I don't think people understand the incredible damage that's done by these stay away orders. They are horrible. There's no excuse for them. And usually the explanation and the excuse that's given in guardianship is that when the family member visits, the ward becomes upset. They
Mhm.
become sad. Well, of course they do.
Mhm.
Of course they do. They cry. They say, "Where have you been? Do you
Mhm.
not love me anymore? Do you not care
Mm.
about me?" Which is exactly what they're told after the stay away order is initiated, or if the person has been banned from entering the private property. When the ward asks, and this is from testimony of families and wards that I've spoken to, they're told, "Your family isn't coming to see you anymore. They don't care about you anymore."
Mm.
I mean, just think of the cruelest thing you can say to a person
Mm.
who has no defenses, who's vulnerable, who's already woozy from all the medications. Of course they're sad. Of course they can't sleep. Of course they don't have an appetite. Of course the drugs kill their appetite. And all of this leads to the deficiency of the person. That is, they're nutritionally deficient, they are not hydrated properly,
Mm.
they are not hydrated properly, they don't get enough sunshine, so their bones break. They get no stimulation other than a television for weeks and months on end. They get no visitors. What a horrible existence. But it's in the guardianship's best interest to keep them alive.
Mhm.
Why? They don't want them to die, because when they die, the will comes into effect and they can't plunder the estate anymore. Now,
Mhm.
I realize that's a terribly cynical way of looking at things, but it's also an objective way of looking at things. And so you'll find any senior warehousing facility you go to, you'll find these people in jerry chairs, tied up, drooling,
Mhm.
zombie like. And if you look at their medication list, it's huge. And but they're still alive.
Mhm.
And while they're alive, the guardianship system can continue to bill and drain their estates and manifest their ultimate control over another human being. It's a system going
Mhm.
back up to the 30,000-foot level that fails because it depends on the good intentions of people who are in a for-profit system. And those good intentions are often, if not always, overridden by greed, power, and abuse.
Mm. Do you think things can change at all in the future?
Um, no, I do not. And the reason I say that is because I've been involved with this for more than a decade. I think it's 12 years now. I have to go back and check
Mhm.
the recording a second.
Okay.
Let's start again.
Okay.
I've been at this for 10 or 12 years now. I don't remember exactly. And I have been witness to very bright people, very dedicated people banging their heads against the wall to change this system by legislative changes.
Mhm.
As I mentioned earlier, there have been countless changes to the laws in this state and every other state about guardianship abuse. Yet,
Mhm.
there's no indication that the abuse has decreased in any way. I believe, it's my personal opinion, that unless we reimagine how we deal with the vulnerable people in our country,
Mhm.
I like the word reimagine, it's a very chic thing to do. Um, we will maintain this system because it's so profitable. So we
Mhm.
have to think of alternatives. And there are alternatives. They're not perfect, but I think they're worthwhile considering. And that is elder care and coordination, which is a court ordered uh, kind of mediation that involves social workers and attempts to bring families together to solve problems that they've never been able to solve before. Well, that's nice if people want to solve problems, but when
Mhm.
you say, well, I'll solve this problem and it'll cost me money, but if I do it the old way and get a lawyer, I'll make money. So I don't know about that.
Mhm.
Um, but there are other methodologies out there, such as supported decision making, which has its pluses and minuses, but none of them are perfect because honestly, our society doesn't know what to do with the elderly, the incapacitated, the different. We're not good at it
Mhm.
because we had our biases. We live a certain way, and we expect to be able to ask the courts to solve our problems for us.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, the courts, especially the equity courts, which have no juries, no rules of evidence, no rules of procedure, they're all sequestered, they're all in secret, you can never get the files. The equity courts in particular are are really not well equipped to do this in an open and honest fashion. They do it in an expedient fashion, which is why we have so many guardianships and so many divorces and so many alienated children
Mhm.
who are so horribly damaged by the process that they become drug addicts and suicidal. You know all these statistics. But it's basically the same problem. When we trust government to solve our personal problems, what do you expect?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I don't think that'll be solved in my lifetime or even in my children's lifetime.
Mhm.
So, what we need to do is be aware of these issues and prevent them from happening to us. And
Mhm.
that's where I think we should move on. How do you prevent guardianship? If only I knew. But
Mhm.
one way to try to
Mhm.
prevent guardianships is to settle your family disputes, if at all possible, because the impetus for the guardianship is all too often from a family member.
Mhm.
Could be a son or a daughter, but it could be a distant cousin, it could be an ex-wife, it could be an ex-business partner, but statistically it comes from some kind of family problem. So try to settle those. The second is to make your wishes well known to everybody who matters, meaning your advance directives have to be perfect, which include a phrase that says, under no circumstances do I permit, allow, condone, or want a professional guardian to be appointed over me. That's a very important phrase because if it isn't in your advance directives,
Mhm.
the judge can say, well, I don't see anything here that they didn't want a professional guardian. You follow?
Mhm.
And third is to be aware. Be aware of your surroundings. If you feel that a guardianship is about to take place, there are things you can do with your loved one if you're interested in their welfare. And I outline a lot of those in my book, Guardianships in the Elderly, The Perfect Crime. There are articles on it on our website, www.aaapg.net. And being aware, making plans, making sure everybody's on board are some of the steps that you can take before the word guardianship ever enters your lexicon. Once it does, it's too late.
Mhm.
It's way too late. So those are little hints, and it's above and beyond the scope of this discussion to talk
Mhm.
about more detailed ones. But there are people in the United States who've been affected by this, who've come together to form organizations like ours, Americans
Mhm.
Against Abuse of Probate Guardianship, others that have been around for a long time, like the National Association to Stop Guardianship Abuse, or CEAR, CEAR, the to event, I can never remember but CEAR, talking about estate abuse,
Mhm.
run by a former colleague of mine, and others around the country. So there are resources, there are organizations, there is information, and if you do have family abuse, if you
Mhm.
do have family disputes, recognize that you're at high risk of losing your mom or dad or your loved one.
Well, that's interesting, and I'm glad for all your advice. And I know I'd like to have you back on for another podcast to talk about these 18-year-olds that suddenly disappear.
What a terrible topic.
W well, it's happening, out in Missouri, 1,000 foster children just disappeared into thin air. And what happened? N It just swept under the rug.
It is awful. And the guardianship mess is awful, and the divorce mess is awful, and the parental alien, all of it's awful. And you have to wonder, it's not a secret that this goes on. I mean, the fact that we're talking about this publicly, thank God this isn't Russia or we'd all be shot.
Mhm.
Uh, but in this great country,
Mhm.
and I am a patriot, I love this country. I came here when I was 2 years old as a refugee, a Holocaust survivor kid. Um, I'm grateful to this country. I love this country, but it's not perfect, and it has some really bad flaws that have their roots hundreds of years ago
Mhm.
that really shouldn't be applied in 21st century America. That's why I say guardianship is an anachronism. It just doesn't work right. If it did work right and it were monitored and supervised correctly,
Mhm.
I'd say great, but it doesn't in a
Mhm.
lot of these cases. And we need to come to grips with that reality. Our society is wonderful, but it's imperfect. And the problems that we have are serious. And those of us who speak up about those problems do so not because we have some kind of an agenda to destroy the courts or make guardianship punishable by death. No, we are not enemies of guardianship because an enemy wants you dead. We
Mhm.
are critics because a critic wants you better.
Mhm.
I think that's a key discrimination. I'm not an enemy of guardianship, and you're not an enemy of alienation. You're a critic because you don't want it. You don't want to kill those people. You want them to be better so the
Mhm.
system works better. And I think if people just understood that, a better level of understanding would ensue and progress could be made.
Definitely. Well, thank you for coming on the show. Don't jump off. Slam the Gavel's a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in the family courtrooms. I'm your host, Maryann Petri, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. Please join us again here with Dr. Sam Sugar in the future and other guests. Thank you again, Dr. Sam.
Thank you.